Thank you, Chris. And I've been warned that academics tend to go on a bit, so feel free to give me a warning. Look, I want to, and thanks for inviting me, and I also like to pay my respects to the Whadjuk people before I start, and also. I'll pay my respects to the Whadjuk people before I start, but also make the point that quite often when we look at Indigenous struggles, we forget that they've been intertwined with some of these global conflicts. Look at the nuclear testing that was, Maralinga, which is kind of absolutely connected to Australia's links with the UK and the kind of geostrategic Cold War battles that were being fought. And I think sometimes we tend to see Indigenous struggles as somehow outside of these broader geopolitical conflicts, when in fact, historically and currently, they're very much part and parcel of these issues. So it's something I think we should bear in mind. So the thrust of my comments here, and in a sense, it's to kind of put AUKUS in context, but also to put AUKUS in the context of global capitalism. And one of the things I want to do in this talk here is to actually make the link between the kind of geopolitics that we see, the geopolitical conflicts that we see occurring around us, of which AUKUS is part of, in terms of the broader crisis and tensions within global capitalism. And I think, so this is not just, and I want to make the point that, we can sort of say, well, that's just an academic point, but I want to make, and I think it has real implications for people struggling against AUKUS, because I think we need, the basic thrust of my comment is to see AUKUS as part of a wider struggle, as a part of a wider set of contradictions that are emerging within global capitalism. And I think a US British, but now living in the US academic, Adam Tooze has come up with this notion of a polycrisis, right? So this idea that, which is kind of an interesting kind of heuristic concept, the idea that a lot of the crises that we're seeing, ecological, geopolitical, the economic crisis, are interconnected. And it's the interconnectedness of crisis that is a distinctive feature of what we're experiencing in the 21st century. And I think AUKUS is part and parcel of this polycrisis. So one of the things I wanted to talk about is AUKUS as, in a sense, a response to the crisis of global capitalism, but also a response to the crisis of global capitalism and its management by the US, particularly since the end of the Cold War. The forms of neoliberal capitalism, and I won't go into details on some of these concepts, but the kinds of the forms of capitalism that emerged at the end of the Cold War, the World Trade Organization, so on and so forth, are precisely, and this is the irony, is it not? Are precisely the institutions that have now been detonated by the US, right? So so it's this crisis of the management of global capitalism. In Australia, the whole strategy of Asian engagement emerged out of that process of global capitalism. So, and I think the crisis for Australia is precisely, that crisis of Asian engagement is linked to the broader crisis of this management of the post-Cold War order. And of course, it's that post-Cold War order that also birthed the rise of China. And in this sense, of course, I differ from Vijay Prashad in one sense, is that I see China itself as a capitalist power. And I think what we're seeing in this period is the emergence, if you like, of a kind of inter-imperialist conflict. Very much similar to the kinds of the kind of contradictions that we saw at the turn of the 20th century, but with one difference. Is that they are interconnected, that these economies are interconnected. So, for example, the US might have put sanctions on Chinese semiconductors, but it has backfired on the US in a really big way. It has had negative repercussions on the US economy. And I think what's interesting, and I draw this from a term that Brazilian dependency theory, Marxist dependency theorists argued, was that we see this sort of antagonistic cooperation. So if you like, the post-Cold War period was kind of these multilateral institutions that were set up to manage capitalism. What we're increasingly seeing is this antagonistic cooperation especially between the US and China, but also between some of these BRICS and these other countries. And I think we're in the midst of this. And I think the point I want to make is that the birth of AUKUS, the emergence of AUKUS, is in a sense tied to the kinds of crisis that the US has faced in its own economy. The weakening of economic growth, the inability to sustain the kinds of rises of productivity that it saw in the Cold War period, and its declining dominance of key strategic technology sectors, right? Especially around things like high technology, communications. And those have been the new battle lines. So in a sense, it's a kind of an inter-imperialist conflict, but it's being fought out in this kind of geo-economic front. And that's what's kind of distinctive. And AUKUS, in a sense, exemplifies this because, as Sean will talk about very soon, the pillar 2 of AUKUS is precisely about this economic, so there's this one pillar which is about military. The second pillar is about this economic cooperation agreements, or it's about technology agreements. It's about locking into these economic networks. And it's actually, what I want to emphasize to you here is the interconnection between this geopolitics and this kind of new forms of capitalist networks and relationships and this antagonistic cooperation that is emerging. So one of the, and sort of in another paper, I've sort of coined this as sort of a kind of a militarized neoliberalism, which is the kind of incorporation, and I think this is kind of quite interesting, the incorporation of economic imperatives within new and old security institutions. A case in point is that NATO's recent attempt to harness business capital funds for technology innovations, right? NATO, which in the Cold War was kind of basically a military alliance, is now in the business of starting up venture capital for technology innovations. And I think, this is a small example, but I think in that we see a remarkable change in this global geo-capitalist political economy. And I think we need to understand that China is part of that, so I don't think we should be rose-tinted about China. The economic inequality has been increasing in China. There have been pressures that have been placed on Chinese state because of increasing debt, for example. And its response, just like any other capitalist power, is to engage in this intensified what this Brazilian Marxists call antagonistic cooperation. So what does this all mean? So someone sort of says, well, what does this all mean for us as a movement? And I think this is an important point. And in a sense, I think there are differences, right? So between some of us on these things. I do actually think that our job here is not to say we support one part against another. It's not about geopolitics. To me, one of my heroines is Rosa Luxemburg. And what I liked about Rosa Luxemburg is because she went to prison because she refused to support the German Social Democratic Party's support for Germany in the First World War, is because she refused to take sides. She refused to take sides. And she said, our struggle is against capitalism, and it's to build a movement of emancipation of all people from capitalism. And I think, obviously, the conditions now are not the conditions that Rosa Luxemburg had. The kinds of movements that we talk about have all but disappeared, all but withered. But it doesn't mean that we can't, we still need to return to that internationalist the international solidarity that was so central to Rosa Luxemburg's work, So as she said, she famously said, and I end up with this, Chris, that, it was socialism or barbarism, right? So, and I think, we might be well faced with the same choice at the moment. Perhaps the way we think about socialism might be very different now in the 21st century to how Rosa Luxemburg conceptualized it. But I think that slogan of socialism or barbarism, I think still has a lot of appeal. And I think it has a lot of meaning for movements like yours against things like AUKUS. So thank you.
Thank you.